Thank you all very much. It is really a great pleasure to be with you today. I'm thrilled at the opportunity to be here to learn more about the Masons in California. As you know, this organization and the state have this deeply intertwined history, and I appreciate all the work that all of you have done to explicate it. I'm also delighted to be able to follow up to this podium two men who I greatly admire. Jeff Waren was profoundly helpful to me in research about his grandfather. One of the nicest days I spent in researching this book was drinking wine with Jeffrey and talking about his grandfather, which for me is pretty much a taste of heaven. Also, by the way, my book closes with the passages that Jeffrey read you earlier from that poem. It does so because you shared them with me, and I thank you. I'm also a great fan of Ed Cray. Ed's biography of Warren was invaluable to me and my work in understanding our common subject. I cited it in my book and appreciated it greatly. So it's a treat to be here with both Jeff and Ed. Our next speaker is going to talk a bit more about Warren and his experience with the Masons and some of the ways in which Masonry informed Warren's life. So I'm not going to go into any great detail here, but let me at least just note a few points from his record in that regard. As was noted earlier, Earl Warren was raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason on November 1st, 1919 in Sequoia Lodge number 349 at Oakland. He became a steward in 1922, a junior deacon in 1924, a senior deacon in 1925, a junior warden in 1926, a senior warden in 1927, and a master in 1928. I must admit to you, I don't really know what that means, but I suspect you do. Throughout those years, and despite a growing family and very busy public life, he rarely missed an event connected to this organization. In 1935, again, as you know, he was elected Grand Master of the Masons for California. There is no doubt but that this organization helped to form him as a young man, gave shape and significance to the emerging political figure that he was, and the political figure who would go on to give so much back to the country. What's more, and again here I tread a little carefully, but the symbols and ideas of Masonry, at least as I understand them, are really evident in many aspects of the core of Warren's character. Take, for instance, the notion of balance or equality, as symbolized, I gather, by the level pendulum. Warren was deeply offended by the imbalance between government power and the helplessness of a criminal defendant. And he looked for ways to even those scales, and did so, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. He was troubled by voting schemes that gave more votes to white rural voters than they did to urban black voters. Again, rectified them through his work as Chief Justice. He understood that segregation powerfully reinforced inequality. And the defining feature in some ways of his adult professional life was his search for a balance between national security and personal liberty. Finally, of course, the plum of justice crystallizes obligations that Warren willingly assumed as Chief Justice of the United States. Our next speaker, again, I will go into that, I suspect, in greater detail and much more capably than I can. So instead, let me devote the balance of my remarks to Warren's life, his leadership, and his legacy. And in this regard, I'm sure I will overlap a little bit with both Ed and Jeffrey. Earl Warren was born in 1891. He's the last Chief Justice of the United States, born in the 19th century in Los Angeles, not far from Union Station. When he was a child, his family moved to Bakersfield, where he grew up. His parents both were immigrants, one Norwegian, one Swedish, and his father was a railroad man, worked for the Southern Pacific. Little Earl Warren loved his pets. He had a donkey named Jack that he was especially fond of. And as he grew older, I have a son named Jack, by the way, but that's not because of the donkey. As he grew older, he too took a summer job with the Southern Pacific. He was a call boy, meaning that when the call went out for railroad men to report to their trains, it was his job to go through town and round them up out of bars and whorehouses and the like. That early experience gave him a lifelong distaste for vice and disorder. We talked earlier about order and organization, ideas that were very important to Warren, even before he was a Mason. When later, much later, as Chief Justice, Warren was asked to consider whether certain pornographic publications deserved constitutional protection, he found the process of reviewing them appalling, unlike William Douglas, who rather liked it. And he searched always for ways to punish what he called peddlers of smut. He once said, in fact, I think it's maybe Jeffrey that told me this, that if anyone showed one of these magazines to his daughter, he'd punch him in the mouth. In 1908, he enrolled at the University of California at Berkeley, then the center of California's intellectual class, and a place that Warren loved intensely. He was not such a great student, frankly, but he was okay, and he was a ebullient joiner of clubs and organizations, maker friends. He joined a fraternity and enjoyed it very much. When the time came after his graduation from both first undergraduate and then law school, also at Berkeley, he enlisted in the Army to serve his country during World War I. He never saw combat, but he was fierce with a bayonet and someone his men greatly admired. Returning from his military service, he flirted with private practice, but quickly landed a job as a prosecutor in Alameda County. His first case that he brought to trial, ended in the conviction of a man who was tried for violating California's what were called anti-syndicalism laws. These were laws that forbade the advocacy of violence against the government or social institutions. Interestingly, one of Warren's last cases as Chief Justice was to strike the constitutionality of anti-syndicalism laws, bringing his life full circle in legal sense. He was, as one of the great scholars of the Warren Court once pointed out to me, he was the rare man who really got better in every job he did. And I think you see that over the course of his life. He became district attorney of Alameda. He may not become a better driver, by the way, but he did become a better lawyer. He became district attorney in Alameda, the head of the office, by appointment. And then later he retained that office by winning election to it in 1926. One of his most celebrated and controversial cases as district attorney was the murder prosecution of 4 men who were accused of murdering a shipmate. Warren took that case to trial and alleged to the jury that the murder was perpetrated by communists, and he prosecuted it with great vigor, and as I say, to some controversy. Those men also were convicted. By the end of the 1930s, San Quentin housed many defendant who was placed there by Earl Warren. He believed not only in mercy, but also in punishment. And there is no evidence at any point in his career that he was in any sense soft on communism. He was deeply committed to service. From the day of his entry into the Alameda District Attorney's Office until his retirement from the Supreme Court in 1969, Earl Warren held public office without a single day of interruption. He won 7 elections, and he spent more than 50 years in the service of his county, state, and nation. Excuse me. He married Nina Warren on October 14th, 1925. Together, they raised 6 children to fine and solid adulthood. Theirs was a very, very traditional family. He presided and worked. She nurtured and ran the home. On Sundays, he would take the children for the day to give Nina some time off for herself. Their family life, for the most part, was placid and comfortable, though it was occasionally rocked. In 1938, in the midst of Earl Warren's campaign for Attorney General of California, his father was murdered in his Bakersfield home. He was beaten to death with a pipe, and the assailant was never found. On Election Day in 1950, Honey Bear Warren, the sparkling youngest daughter of Earl and Nina, was stricken with polio. She recovered, much to the delight, obviously, of her mother and father, and also to the state of California, which followed her illness with great anxiety. She, too, incidentally, was of great help to me with the book, and she is exactly as vivacious today as she was when she was captured in California in 1950. Warren was elected Attorney General in that election in 1938. 4 years later, he ran for governor of California, and he won that, too. His record in that office is second to none. He gave California its highway system as we know it. He significantly expanded the University of California. He ended school segregation that had permitted so-called Mexican schools in California. And he guided California through World War II and its aftermath. He believed, as progressives did in those days, in efficiency and planning. He invested in public health and juvenile corrections. He actually came within a single vote of establishing universal health insurance for all Californians. He secured passage of the Brown Act, which required and still requires government work in the state to be performed in public. Finally, he inherited a considerable bonded indebtedness from Colbert Olson, his predecessor, and yet he left the state with a sizable surplus when he left. He did all of that at a time of enormous social pressure in the state. Immigrants flooded to California in the 1940s and 1950s. And far from fighting that flood, Warren welcomed it. It would have been tremendously easy and politically expedient for him to demonize these new immigrants, to come up with programs that might discourage them from coming. Instead, he relished what they brought to California. He saw them not as a burden, but as a source of vitality and growth. He liked to say that his job was to provide for 10,000 new inhabitants every Monday morning, and he enjoyed it. That alone, I should add, should give us reason to reflect on his leadership in the gubernatorial years. So many of those who have followed Warren have failed to appreciate his example with respect to immigration and have succumbed to nativism and fear. Warren did not. Someone, just as a little aside here, someone once asked me how many justices at the Supreme Court would be worth a biography if they had never served on the court. Thurgood Marshall, who Ed mentioned earlier, certainly would be one for his work as a pioneer and civil rights lawyer. Maybe the most obvious would be William Howard Taft, who was actually president of the United States before he became Chief Justice. And there are a few others, Hugo Black, maybe, John Marshall, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had a very distinguished career as a lawyer before coming to the court. But after that, I must say, the list gets fairly short fairly quickly. Warren clearly, however, would be among those for his work as governor in the state. He was, as Ed mentioned, until recently, the only person ever elected 3 times to be governor of California. Jerry Brown ruined my line about this by running and winning, and actually just recently surpassed Warren's record for tenure for overall days because Warren left in the middle of the 3rd term. Still, Warren remains the only person ever elected to 3 consecutive terms as governor, and each of those elections, I think, is worth pausing to talk about just for a second. In the first of those 3 elections, in 1942, he beat an incumbent Democrat in a Democratic state where that Democrat was heartily supported by FDR, the incumbent Democratic president, and he did it in the middle of a war, importantly. In the third of those 3 elections, he did one better than beating an ally of FDR. He beat his son, Jimmy Roosevelt, and he beat him by more than 1 million votes. And then in that interim election in 1946, in some ways is the most interesting of all, at least by today's standards, it took place in an era of cross-filing where candidates could run for the nomination of either party. Warren did. He was easily nominated by the Republican Party. He was a Republican and an incumbent. But he was also nominated by the Democratic Party that year. He is that, by the way, is a record that Jerry Brown will not be tying anytime soon. No person has ever dominated California politics more for a greater period, more thoroughly or for a greater period of time. His life, as all of that indicates, was sprawling. Few men or women of any generation have done more to affect their times. As such, it was controversial, and it's important to acknowledge that he was not always right. In 1942, again, as Ed has mentioned, while serving as Attorney General, he joined the clamor that demanded the internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast. He was unfortunately a very persuasive advocate, and he was in this case too. In this case, he was an advocate for a program that rounded up 110,000 Americans and incarcerated them for no crime at all. He was dreadfully wrong and never did admit it. Never in his lifetime did he find the words to apologize for that act. He was, among other things, and I think Jeff will back me up here, a very stubborn man. In 1953, a year into Warren's 3rd term, President Eisenhower nominated him to become the 14th Chief Justice of the United States. Warren and Ike had competed for the Republican nomination the year before, and Eisenhower, of course, had come out the winner. Ed gave you one sort of accounting of this idea that there was a trade in which Warren agreed to throw his delegates to Eisenhower in return for the nomination. I actually read the material somewhat differently. Warren actually did continue to fight for his nomination up until Eisenhower secured the nomination without Warren's delegates. There were some procedural back and forth, and so there's a little bit of mystery around that. But for what it's worth, at the end of it, Ike came away respecting Warren greatly and did, in fact, promise him the first vacancy on the court. This is, by the way, after passing him up for the cabinet, which Warren had thought he might be a candidate for. And then, of course, again, as Ed has said, when Fred Vinson died just a few months after Eisenhower became president, first Eisenhower hesitated, which I would argue argues in favor of the notion that there wasn't a deal. He offered it to John Foster Dulles, who turned it down. But in the end, he did, in fact, deliver this promised nomination, and Warren, of course, took it and took his place. He left the governorship of California, by the way, on a Friday evening and was sworn in as Chief Justice the following Monday. The mutual admiration between Warren and Ike faded within a single year. Warren resented very much Eisenhower's unwillingness to back up the court on civil rights, and Eisenhower fumed at an appointee who he saw as increasingly annoyingly independent. We can talk more about this if you want during the panel part of our conversation, by the way. But let me just say for the moment that the breakdown in their relations is in some ways a fairly stunning reminder of the power of misunderstanding. It is true, Warren was mad at Ike over civil rights. Eisenhower was mainly mad at Warren for his handling of a set of cases involving communist defendants when their First Amendment rights. But Ike actually was better on civil rights than I think Warren imagined it would be, and Warren was impeccably correct on the First Amendment cases and the communists. So had they done more to understand each other, I actually think that they wouldn't have ended up so much at odds. Eisenhower left office, as you know, in 1961. Warren served another 8 years on the court and was joined during that time by justices who were put there first by Kennedy and, of course, later by Johnson. It's really during those years that the Warren Court blossomed from a kind of lonely advocate for civil rights into a functioning component of a united and progressive American government. Those years from 1962 to 1968 can be regarded, are properly regarded as the heyday of the Warren Court and also of the high watermark of American civil liberties. They were also difficult, terribly difficult, and sometimes tragic times. For many, Warren's service and life are most calamitously symbolized by his chairmanship of the Warren Commission, so named for him, obviously, which, as you know, examined the deaths of President Kennedy and Officer Tippit nearly 50 years ago, in fact, 50 years ago this month. Warren did not ask for the job of chairing the Warren Commission. He actually turned it down at first and only relented when Johnson, meeting with him in person, and Johnson, who always seemed to know the key to getting to a man's soul, reached inside and found it in Warren by appealing to his patriotism. Johnson reminded Warren that he'd worn a uniform in World War I and insisted that this was no less a call to his duty. And if that weren't enough, he also warned him that the uncertainty about the assassination was creating international instability that could result in a war that could result in 40 million Americans dying. This is a difficult thing to say no to, needless to say. Warren left Johnson's office that day in tears. And for the next 10 months, the Chief Justice of the United States, who the Warren Commission rented space just down the street from the court, he would arrive at the commission almost every day at dawn. He would preside over the commission until 10 a.m., at which point he would put on his robe, walk down the street, and preside over the United States Supreme Court. At the end of the day, he would return to the commission until late at night, and then take his legal reading home with him. No other member of the Warren Commission, we know this from the records of the commission, no other member of the commission was so diligent and committed to its work. And no period in his life took a greater toll on Earl Warren than those terrible months of 1964. He contracted a cough, he was rheumy, he was tired. He was 72 years old at the time. In the half century since the Warren Commission completed its work, its report has been subjected to more scrutiny than the findings of any other government commission in the history of the United States. And still, its essential conclusions stand the test of all serious inquiry. Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots that day. One missed, one struck President Kennedy in the back of the neck, passed through his throat and nicked his necktie, then struck Governor Connally. The 3rd shot hit Kennedy in the back of the head and killed him. There was not then and never has been any evidence that Oswald was part of any larger conspiracy. Those were difficult conclusions to reach and to report. Warren did so out of a profound sense of duty to his country and to the memory of a president he deeply admired, as was evidenced by the note that Jeffrey read to you earlier from Jackie. The Warren Commission was a significant, important assignment in Warren's life, but it was a limited one. The Warren Court, on the other hand, was really the fulfillment of his service. And so today, before I sit down, I just want to take a couple of minutes here, not to deliver a whole case-by-case analysis of the Warren Court by any means, but just to tick off a few of its more consequential rulings and to ask you to think about them in the context of the ethics and principles that they express of the Chief Justice. The Warren Court's first great decision, as Ed described, was Brown versus Board. It, of course, held that separate but equal in the field of public education was unconstitutional. And it did so on the premise that separate but equal is a device to enforce inequality. Many regard this, by the way, as certainly the most important Supreme Court decision of the 20th century, perhaps of all time. Warren personally wrote Brown, and he was responsible, as Ed said, for its most salient feature, the unanimity of the court in it. again, we can talk about this more on the panel if you want, but I just note briefly that, as Ed said as well, Brown had been argued before Vinson died, and it's clear from the notes of the conference in that period that there were at least 3 votes on the court before Warren got there to uphold school segregation: Vinson, Clark, and Stanley Reed. It's possible that 2 others would have voted to uphold segregation too, not so much on the principle of segregation itself, but on the notion of what we would today call judicial activism and their desire for the court to exercise restraint, and that would have been Frankfurter and Jackson. So at a minimum, it's clear that Warren delivered a unanimous court where there would have been a divided one. At a maximum, it's possible that his presence actually changed what would have been the outcome. After Brown, excuse me, in a series of subsequent cases, the court extended the reasoning of Brown to end racial segregation in parks, beaches, drinking fountains, and other public facilities. Through those cases, the Warren Court did what neither the president nor the Congress could or were prepared to do. It insisted that racial equality was essential to America's creed. The Warren Court insisted upon fairness in criminal justice. Before 1963, states were free to force defendants to represent themselves at trial, and many did. After Gideon versus Wainwright, written by Justice Black and joined by Warren, all criminal defendants were entitled to a lawyer, even if they could not afford one. 3 years later, the court also required that criminal defendants be informed of their rights when being questioned, the famous Miranda case. No longer would poor or ignorant defendants be coerced simply because they didn't know what better educated or more prosperous people knew, that they could refuse to answer the questions of their interrogator. Both of those cases, and a few other of the criminal justice cases, express Warren's deeply felt sense of egalitarianism, his conviction that this country owes its citizens a sense of equality, not just of race, but of opportunity and of protection of the law. The Warren Court saw itself appropriately as a guardian of the civil rights movement, and as such, it really spent a lot of time during the 1960s, 50s, and 60s sniffing out creative attempts to shut down or thwart the civil rights movement. In the early 1960s, Southern segregationists suddenly discovered a new tool that really could have shut down a great deal of public outrage. Segregationist officials realized that they could sue news organizations and with the help of Southern juries win large, even crippling libel judgments that so crippling that newspapers would have to pull out of the South, ending coverage and therefore public knowledge of what was going on. So the Supreme Court instead crafted new rules of libel that protected an aggressive press in its efforts to report vigorously on the acts of public officials. This is the New York Times versus Sullivan case. That decision, as I say, New York Times versus Sullivan, that was written by Justice Brennan, who happened to be Warren's best ally and friend on the court, also joined by Warren. The Warren Court championed the primacy of free and fair elections, stripped of poll taxes, literacy tests, and schemes to weight votes. Most importantly, it rejected districting systems that gave more power to rural voters than to those who live in cities. These are the cases known as Baker versus Carr and Reynolds versus Sims. Before the Warren Court, states that wanted to tilt those voting scales could and did. After it, the principle of one vote, one person, one vote governed in all American elections. Interestingly, Warren, by the way, when he was governor, didn't have much of a problem with this kind of weighting, but as he said, it didn't occur to him. It's unlikely that it would have occurred to a person who had won 7 elections in California. But in any case, he was late to the party, but he did get there. The Warren Court in 1962 held that states could not impose religious views on children, and just that children could not be required to recite government-written prayers in school. This remains, by the way, one of the court's still most hotly disputed cases. It has wrongly been called anti-religious. It isn't. Here is language from the decision itself, this written by Hugo Black and again joined by Warren. The court wrote, quote, "It is neither sacrilegious nor anti-religious to say that each separate government in this country should stay out of the business of writing or sanctioning official prayers." Finally, the Warren Court concluded, some say invented, the idea that a theory of privacy pervades the Constitution and as such protects each of us from an intrusive government. It found, in other words, that all of us have the right to be beyond the reach of government in certain affairs, to be free to be ourselves in our most private lives. In the case of the Warren Court, it announced that right in 1965 to strike down a Connecticut law that prohibited married couples from purchasing contraceptives. The right of privacy since, as you all know, has become embroiled in our unending national debate over abortion. But it's important to remember that privacy at its core is a restraint on government and an insistence on individual liberty. Whatever else one thinks about privacy, it is a profoundly conservative idea. Before I conclude, I just would ask you to take a moment to reflect on that record and to consider it as a legacy of leadership. Forget for a moment the cliche of the Warren Court as a liberal institution or an activist court, and ask these questions instead. Which of those values that I just described to you would we reject today? Who among us, liberal or conservative, believes that racial equality is not a national ambition of this country? Does anyone here think that weighting the votes of agricultural communities more heavily than the votes of city residents would produce a better democracy? Does anyone believe that trials would be fairer if poor defendants had to represent themselves, or that our criminal justice system would produce better outcomes if some suspects confessed because they didn't understand their rights while others who were richer or better educated didn't? In the area of privacy and prayer, ask these questions. Would any of you want your children reciting a prayer every morning written by Jerry Brown or Arnold Schwarzenegger? And does anyone here think that the government really ought to be able to do as it pleases, to invade bedrooms or boardrooms undeterred by privacy interests of its citizens? In the course of his long, public and controversial life, Earl Warren was often accused of giving aid and comfort to the Communist Party. He shrugged off demands for his impeachment, raised by members of Congress and posted to trees and billboards all across the country, including close to here. He endured death threats. He and Nina woke one night to the blaze of a cross being burned on their lawn. He was not perfect, but even his most criticized moments are revealing. He made his greatest mistake, his support for the Japanese internment, out of a misguided sense of patriotism and national security. He accepted the chairmanship of the Warren Commission when a determined president again appealed to his patriotism. He was a man of simple values, deeply held. He loved his country and his family. He was a hunter and a fisherman. He was a Grand Master of the Masons, a member of the Bohemian Club. He was a Republican, and he was a patriot. When he died in 1974, he left a strong family and devoted friends, and he bequeathed the rest of us a more mature and thoughtful country. The nation that Warren made was one more committed to fairness, not just as an idea, but as something close to a constitutional principle. In argument and in deliberation, Warren would often reduce a dispute to a simple question. He would ask, is it fair? Now, that may not dazzle constitutional theorists, but it grounded his work in real life. And it bent his decisions toward the center, not to the left or the right. It is hard for me to see how any intellectually honest person could object to such a notion. Earl Warren's legacy holds the seeds of a better country, and his leadership across many decades is proof that division need not destroy us. His life stands as a reminder that the values of family and community and fellowship are entirely compatible with the unapologetic assertion of civil liberties. His work should remind us that this country is no country at all unless it is a free country, and that to dismantle freedom in order to secure our borders is to break from within what we would fight to the death to keep from being taken by others. Warren reinforced and extended those values, paid a price at times, and he bore it proudly. We are a better country because of him, and he deserves our admiration. So I thank all of you for the strength and values of your order and for infusing Earl Warren with it. And I thank you very much for the chance to be here with you this weekend.